Good evening. Thank you for joining David Demchuk in conversation with Amanda Leduc. On the right-hand side of your screen is a chat box. Please use the same chat box to ask questions to our speakers. In these chilly days of almost winter, we are here to discuss David's recent novel, Red X, a horror set in Toronto's gay village that is equally rooted in the supernatural and the realities of a marginal life. In a review on Tor Nightfire, Sam Readers says, quote, "It's a complex, disturbing, challenging, and compulsively readable work that commands your attention and indeed deserves it," unquote. My name is Nancy, and I'm tremendously pleased to host this conversation about words and the world. I will take a moment to acknowledge that the city of Hamilton is situated upon the traditional territories of the Erie, Neutral, Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and Mississaugas. This land is covered by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, which was an agreement between the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabeg to share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. We further acknowledge that this land is covered by the Between the Lakes Purchase of 1792 between the Crown and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. Today, the city of Hamilton is home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we recognize that we must do more to learn about the rich history of this land so that we can better understand our roles as residents, neighbors, partners, and caretakers. We encourage you to find David and Amanda's publications at local independent bookstores like Epic Books at their Locke and Sherman Avenue locations, King West Books in Westdale, The City in the City on Ottawa Street, and all retailers that support books and literacy. David Demchuk has been writing for print, stage, digital, and other media for nearly 40 years. His debut horror novel, The Bone Mother, published in 2017, was nominated for the Scotiabank Giller Prize, the Amazon First Novel Award, the Toronto Book Award, the Kobzar Book Award, and a Shirley Jackson Award in the Best Novel category. It won the 2018 Sunburst Award for Excellence in Canadian Literature of the Fantastic in the Adult Fiction category. It was listed in the Globe and Mail's 100 Best Books of 2017, came in at number 22 in the National Post Top 99 Books of the Year, and became a number one bestseller on Amazon.ca. Amanda Leduc is the author of the novel The Centaur's Wife, Random House Canada 2021, and the nonfiction book Disfigured on Fairy Tales, Disability, and Making Space, Coach House Books 2020, which was shortlisted for the 2020 Governor General's Award in Nonfiction and longlisted for the 2020 Barbellion Prize. She is also the author of an earlier novel, The Miracles of Ordinary Men, ECW Press 2013. She has cerebral palsy and lives in Hamilton, Ontario, where she serves as the communications coordinator for the Festival of Literary Diversity, FOLD, Canada's first festival for diverse authors and stories. So I'll pass things over to Amanda, who will begin the conversation. Thank you, Amanda.
Thanks so much, Nancy. It's so wonderful to be here tonight. I'm so excited to get into our conversation. And I thought we would start, David, with there's a possibility that some people in the audience tonight may not have read your book. So I wondered if you could maybe just give us a little bit of a taste of it and talk a little bit about what the novel delves into and the sorts of things that you were thinking about when you were working on it.
Yes, what was I thinking? So the novel is Red X. It is published by Strange Light, which is an experimental imprint of Penguin Random House. Like my first book, which was The Bone Mother, it was based on a play. I have been a playwright for many years. I may one day go back, I have no idea, but for now I'm taking a rest from that. And this was a play that I had started in 2014, and then couldn't quite get into the shape that I wanted it to, and so put it away. It was at the time there were elements that were very similar. There were disappearances of gay men in Toronto's gay village. Toronto's gay village has a rich history that stretches back to before Toronto was a city, back when it was the town of York. So, more than 200 years ago. And of course, it's known as an area that was owned by Alexander Wood, who was one of our pioneers from Scotland, and who was close with the family compact that effectively ruled this part of Upper Canada, and so he was presumed. Well, he was accused. We can start there. He was accused of sexually assaulting some young men in his position as magistrate, and there are various questions around what exactly did happen, and was he framed or was he not, and for well or for ill, he became our gay pioneer, and which was really great. We have a statue of him that people are now discussing pulling down, and who can blame them, and so I wanted to investigate the notion of the disappearances, the notion of a history of disappearances of gay men, not just here in Toronto, but also in other cities, in other countries around the world. This is something that has happened and probably will continue to happen for many years to come. At the time that I was writing the play, 3 men had recently disappeared. And by the time I put the play away and then took it out again and then started writing it as a book, more men had disappeared. Mm-hmm. And I had continued to explore the notion of men disappearing and so on, but there at that point was not any clear idea of what was going on. And of course, as many people in Toronto know, we were continually told by the police, we being the gay community, there is no serial killer. These are individual events. They are not connected to each other. And then as I was writing, and as I was writing as well about my relationship to the material that I was writing, because I had questions myself about why I was drawn to horror, what queerness and horror have connecting themselves and so on. Someone I knew disappeared, who was, in fact, quite unlike everybody else who had disappeared. And then his remains were found. And then we discovered the secret behind these disappearances and who was responsible. And that actually, for me, ground the book to a halt. I actually turned to a close friend of mine, Ing Wong Ward, who was a journalist and a disability activist, and who was very close to me during the period that I was writing the book. And I said to her, I cannot write this book. It is irresponsible to write this book. And not only that, I feel implicated and compromised in doing so. And in a classic sort of journalistic way, she was like, no, you must write this book. More than ever, you must write this book. And she could be very vivid in her opinions. And so I was like, okay, well, there is no way to write this book without acknowledging what's going on, because there is a real world component to this now that is not abstract or theoretical. It's right in front of our faces. And so that's how the book came to be what it is. What the book is it's on 2 tracks, effectively. There is a fictional track. There are fictional men who are disappearing from a fictional version of Toronto's gay village, albeit with real landmarks and real place names and things like that, over a period of just over 30 years. And of course, it's a horror novel, so of course it's a monster. It is not, an individual. It is a creature. And then surviving characters, who have lost people and who are trying to sort of make their way through the nightmare of this situation, in a way kind of come together and come to realize that there is a monster responsible and that a confrontation is going to have to occur one way or another, which is a classic sort of horror novel kind of structure. And then interspersed between the sections of the book over a period of like 8 years each, there are essays by me, about me, about my love of horror and my conflicted, I would say, love of horror, around the relationship between queerness and horror, around various aspects of Toronto's history, around my disability, which is hypokalemic periodic paralysis, which not everyone is expected to know about, or frankly, even say. And but it's relatively rare. It affects 1 in 100,000 people. But it's pretty much what it says on the label. Hypo is too little, kalemic is potassium, periodic is every once in a while, paralysis is can't move. And we'll talk about that more, later on. But those aspects in those essays are a counterpoint to the action that's going on throughout the book. So at the very least, you won't be bored. if you get to the end of a section, you think, oh, I'd like a break from this. I give you a break. And then once you've had the break, you can go back in and hopefully whatever I've said in the nonfiction sections shed some light on things that are going on in the fiction sections. At this point, I don't think it's a huge spoiler to say quite late in the book, reality and fiction converge, both on the page and in my life, and I make an appearance in the novel, hopefully in a productive and thoughtful way. So there ends up being, more than the meta narrative that you've had up to that point. At that point, things go in a whole other direction entirely. There's a map. There are some illustrations. My bare ass is on the back. I'm not sure that that's a selling point. But yes, it's a decidedly unusual approach to horror. It's a decidedly unusual approach to memoir, but both of those elements are in play.
I mean, decidedly unusual in those elements, yes. But it really works wonderfully. And one of the things that really struck me, and maybe this sounds unusual in and of itself, is that it really feels like it also follows a structure that's quite similar to fairy tales in some ways, yes. In the sense that the edges of the story are murky and you kind of can't see them sometimes. You sometimes don't understand what's going on, but you're sort of in the story boat and it's carrying you along. And one of the things that you talk about in the book is your fascination with fairy tales and how your mother read fairy tales to you when you were young, and that was sort of your formal introduction to story. And we'll talk about this too when we talk about your relationship to queerness and storytelling. But you mentioned how even as a young child, you sort of understood reading fairy tales that, you weren't the kind of kid that was going to be the prince in the fairy tale. You were going to be, the child who was maybe a villain. Or somebody else in the tale, right? And that struck me because I think, there's something certainly in the disability community, a lot of us, have that experience. We understand that there are some people who look and walk and move a certain way who will always get the happy ending, right? The beautiful blonde, blue-eyed princess or the blonde, blue-eyed prince kind of deal. Nothing against blondes and blue-eyed people. But then, there are other people for whom the sort of villain nature of things or the unhappy ending those are reserved for those kinds of people. And I wonder how that spurred on your storytelling and your sort of relationship to the stories that you wanted to tell, and then also to yourself as you went through your development as a storyteller.
Well, I mean, I think one of the things that really compelled me, particularly as I got older, as you mentioned, there is an absence of me and people like me, of us, in these stories. And when you are characterized in these stories, the old woman who's hunched over, who's ugly, who's disfigured, who's, and everything around disability, everything around difference is othered, and is othered in a negative way. And and basically is used as a shorthand, for evil and villainy and a twisted character in some way. If you're twisted on the outside, you're twisted on the inside, and of course, and queerness plays into that as well. Everything, in the majority of fairy tales that I was exposed to, most of the stories I was exposed to as a child, was all situated around heteronormativity. And the happy ever after was only ever earned by people who were straight. And if you didn't see yourself in that, then again, that meant that you were the person around difference and evilness and villainy clustered. Or if you were, I suppose, lucky, you could be a victim. There's like hero, victim, and villain. There's not a lot of, shading around any of this stuff. And so as a result, villainy becomes really interesting. Also, it has to be said, some of the fairy tale characters are very bland, and so you sit there and you think, why would I want to be these people? The villains are so much more interesting. And I mean, when I was a kid, we in particular loved to have Hans Christian Andersen read to us. My mother had a collection that, I don't know, Reader's Digest put together, which I've got to say was ridiculous on the face of it, because it was all of the stuff was completely unsanitized. So the Little Mermaid was just the nastiest, most terrifying thing. The Snow Queen, which is a longtime favorite of mine, again, just a nasty story, and completely terrifying, and not at all. Well, I mean, the Disney villains, and I know we can talk about this later as well, are basically a shadow of what the originals are like. And of course, the Grimm fairy tales are frightening too. So all of this stuff, on one hand, was really terrifying. On the other hand, there was a kind of delight in being scared by them. And I, from an early age, because I like to talk and I like to tell stories, I wanted to know how stories worked. I wanted to know how it is that you engage people with stuff. But inevitably, for me as a child, story seemed to be married to these very specific tropes. And so a lifelong interest of mine has been how to disconnect that, how to place myself in the story, how to understand my place in the story, how to see stories that accommodated me, that I could change, and I could change from within as a writer, and how that would affect the way a story worked. So I think that's been a big factor all the way through.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's something you really can see working on just so many levels in the book, because the way that you bring in these different elements of story, right, and your relationship to these different elements of story with the nonfiction and the fiction, that's all, like, it just works really well together. It's not something you expect as a reader, but somehow it's magic, a horrifying magic, but, magic nonetheless. And, I think too, I mean, for myself as a disabled reader and writer, one of the things that really struck me when I was going through it was how so much of the book is about disability. And, I thought a lot about this sort of disability trope in horror, because obviously in horror movies, there's a lot of horror movies and horror stories in general. I think there's a lot of disability happening. There's a lot of stuff that happens to the body, right? Yes. Whether people get maimed or they get hurt, or they're sort of left maimed as a kind of punishment. And you look at all these themes in the book in really, really interesting ways. Like, you've got characters, I mean, there are a lot of gay men who are dealing with the chronic illness of the AIDS crisis. You have a villain, like a supernatural villain, who is essentially disabling people in very particular gruesome kinds of ways. And still more, when you talk in the autobiographical parts of the book about your own disability and your own relationship to it. And I wondered if you could maybe talk a little bit about, you talk in the book about how your disability is sort of your greatest terror, and also your constant companion, or your greatest threat and your constant companion. And how do you, as a writer, particularly a writer of horror, how do you wrestle with those things, right? Like how do you take something that is at once horrifying, this reality of a disability in your life, but that's something that also becomes very mundane, right? And we work through this in story. And I wonder what was important to you about getting all of that in the book.
Well, the interesting thing about writing horror for me is that, and that I came to realize from early on, was that it allows you as the writer to exercise an element of control over things that in real life you may not be able to control. In fact, frequently cannot control. and it also gives you the opportunity to reflect on what that control means and that loss of control means. So much of horror, it's quite funny right now in this particular period in horror. I don't know if you've seen it. There's a clip of Jamie Lee Curtis talking about the recent Halloween movies, and someone has cleverly taken a snippet from each of her interviews, and she says over and over again, "It's about trauma. It's about trauma. It's about trauma. It's about trauma." She's not wrong. The Halloween movies are in their way about trauma, but it's interesting talking about other aspects of horror that have to do with loss, with grief, with ambiguity, with tension, between one kind of life and another kind of life, and one casting the other in a negative light. And those kinds of things are complex and fascinating and add layers to a lot of what we're grappling with. When it comes to disability, there is the disabled villain. We were talking about, sort of the witch who was hunched over, who had in some ways compensating powers that offset her disability. And then you also have the victim who is vulnerable as a result of their disability. We see this a lot in horror. When I was a kid, my mother had an interesting streak. When I was a kid, they had the movie Wait Until Dark on television with Audrey Hepburn, and my mother had seen it in the theater. And so she wanted us to kind of experience it the way that it had been at the movies, and so she turned out all the lights. And there is notoriously a moment in the film that is pitch dark for a lengthy period of time before there is a reveal that comes from a particular, sort of light source. And it was petrifying. And as a kid, the message in like big, bold letters was, if you were disabled, this is how you were vulnerable. This is how, in a moment, you could forget that able people had the upper hand. And there was that sense that they would always have the upper hand unless someone came to your rescue. And this was a powerful message that I spent many years in my life getting over. The other thing that I spent many years of my life getting over as a disabled person was hatred of my own body, distrust of my own body, hatred of my own body, feeling that my body was like a separate entity from what I considered to be me. And so this over a period of years, this integration needed to happen where I was reconciled to my body, where I learned to embrace my body, and as frustrating as it could be, and see myself and my body as a unit in a new way, and that too was not something that I was handed by an external narrative. That was something that I had to grapple with within myself and try to find ways to represent in my work without someone going, "Oh, here comes the metaphor." It's not a metaphor, it's me. And so when I reached the point where I could talk about it in the book, I thought one of the most important things to do was to just be very explicit about that experience and not hold back. And particularly because I knew my disability was going to be unusual for people who hadn't experienced it before. I think it was referenced once in a movie, and it was one of the Honey, I Shrunk the Kids movies. I think it was the second one. They actually had a child who had hypokalemia and was paralyzed, and they brought him around with a banana. And I was like, oh, If only. If I would have to mainline a bunch of bananas directly into my veins, it's not going to happen. But at least there was one, right? It was very late in my life, but at least there was one. Up until the time that I actually ended up in the hospital, there was nothing. There was nothing. So another thing that was an important component to my disability was thinking I was crazy, because my disability is one that comes and goes. And so it was like, is it a neuromuscular disease? Is there going to be degradation? And my doctors would always be like, there's nothing. You're perfectly fine. We see nothing, And so I thought, okay, well then it's psychosomatic. And when I ended up in the hospital and I was diagnosed, amazingly in a very short period of time, because my potassium had significantly dropped, I turned to the emergency doctor and I said, so this means I'm not crazy? And he said, yes, you are not crazy. This is a real thing. It is really happening. And that, again, not only the distrust of your body, but also the body and the mind, and thinking to yourself, and whatever connection is there. And those things have been really, particularly with this book, because I just thought I would lay it all out. It was really important for me to wrestle with, not necessarily to come to any conclusions about or any kind of catharsis, but mostly to just really try to process. And that ended up becoming a really important aspect of the book, and one that ended up coloring the entire book, which was not something I was fully expecting.
I think that's sometimes how the best stories happen, though, when things kind of come out of nowhere and surprise you about what you're trying to do. And you've mentioned that, weaving your disability and then also queerness into the narrative, it's about figuring something out. But I felt, and I mean, maybe this was, I was reading into it, I don't know, but I felt like there was also something very empowering about the ways that you talk about, understanding your relationship to your body, understanding your relationship to queerness, specifically through horror, and how, this becomes something that terrifies you, but the more you spend with it, the more it becomes something that you recognize. And I wondered if you could maybe talk a little bit about what empowers you as a queer disabled writer about working with horror and sort of looking straight into the heart of things that terrify us.
Well, that's where I think recognition is the key word here, because it's when you don't understand something, it's when you don't know what's going on, it's when you feel that you are outside of whatever explanation it is. That's where the lack of power happens. And for me, the empowerment is the exploration. The empowerment is the trying to understand, maybe not successfully understanding, but at least the attempt to understand and the attempt to reconcile what's going on that does feel so threatening or frightening, and particularly, I mean, this was an important thing that I didn't come into the book with, but that was in fact someone else's message to me. Early on, a friend of mine, Dainty Smith, who is a playwright and a performer, she read an early draft, and I had mainly wanted her as a sensitivity reader, but I was also very curious to see what she would have to say about how it was working in general. And she sat down with me and she said, well, David, you have to know that this is a love story. And I was like, what are you talking about? And she said, between you and the monster. And I was floored. I was I was like, oh, really? Well, that's really great. Thank you very much. Okay, I'm going to go home now. And and I had to go and I had to regroup around that, because, obviously part of horror as a writer is you're coming in touch with sort of a shadow version of yourself that you are trying to grapple with on the page. And so, but it meant that if this was a love story, and I understood her to be correct, then I was going to have to figure out what it was that I was in love with in this monster, and what part of that was me, and how that worked, and because I think it's important for most horror writers to be able to come to terms with that tension within themselves, and to be brave about exploring the dark sides, the dark aspects of themselves. What is my rage? What is my despair? What grief am I carrying? What trauma am I carrying? And how can I learn to embrace and accept it? And so that was absolutely an aspect of it. But one thing that we haven't talked a lot about, that you've invited me to talk about, is queerness. Because while queerness is absolutely not a disability, there is an overlap with that as well. Embracing your queerness, making your queerness an integrated part of your life, part of yourself. And those are things that in many of these narratives have been shut out or pushed aside. It took a very long time as a horror fan for me to start seeing queer characters who are not also being victims, being villains, who are being placed at the center of the narrative in a positive and an identifiable way. And when that finally did happen, I think one of the people who pioneered that was Clive Barker. It was a revelation to me. It was a revelation to have, a horror story that was essentially about a couple bickering in a car and having them be treated just as characters like any other. And I thought to myself, this is something that can be done. Queerness doesn't have to be pathologized the way that disability is pathologized in horror. There are other ways for characters to live. There are other ways for me to express my personal truth within this kind of narrative framework. So and within the genre, and so that was crucial to me. But it's less an endpoint and more an ongoing exploration. And because there are many different aspects of myself that I feel the need to explore in my work. All of them inflected with queerness, with disability, now with advancing age and things like that, with the loss of various people in my life. Those things are all things that I'll want to confront in my work.
I love that idea of it being a love story between you and the monster. And because I think this also touches on a great thread of grief that runs through the book, and we'll get to that in a second. But you talk in the book as well about wanting to subvert and play with, as you've mentioned, that sort of the queerness trope, the queerness or the queer person as villain trope, right? And this is something that the American writer Carmen Maria Machado talks a lot about in her memoir, In the Dream House. She has this whole lovely thread about how, characters, even in Disney, right? People like Ursula the Sea Witch and Jafar and Aladdin, and then you've got Raul Silva in the James Bond film. And there's this very clear coding of queer villains. And, there's a point at which you look at that and you say, oh, well, that's terrible, much as I look at the coding of disabled people as villains in films and say, can't we tell new stories? Can't we have, a way of saying something different about this? But there is also the possibility, like you mentioned earlier, that, the villains are often the most interesting characters in a story. And the villains, making a queer villain, making a disabled villain, you're working within a trope that seems quote unquote normal to the outside audience who is familiar with these kinds of archetypes. But you can also really subvert that in really interesting kinds of ways. And so I wondered if you could talk about that, subverting the queer villain archetype in Red X, because the villain in the novel is he is quite villainous in many ways. He's a monster, but there is something very compelling about him, and very kind of like, by the end of the novel, I was like, oh, I feel for this horrible twisted spirit of a once was human being, and that's a wonderful journey if you as an author can take your readers on a journey like that. And so, yeah, I wondered how subverting that trope worked for you in the book.
Well, I start every sentence with well. what was really important for me, and what's really important for me as a horror reader, is empathy. And I think empathy is one of the driving engines in horror, and if it works well. And you are often put in a position where you have to care for characters that in real life would repel you. In real life, would be, you know, people or things you might cross the street to avoid, you might lock your door against, and and to recognize what it is in them that is also within yourself. Those things, that is really important to me. I mean, there's no question, particularly as I was growing up in the 60s and the 70s, the queer villains were a lot of fun. They were the people who you would want to hang out at a party with. You know, if one was on the couch, you'd want to sit beside her. You know, this was, you know, you would not necessarily want to be their victim. But you absolutely found them to be enticing. They were always more intelligent, better dressed, you know, like just really, really intriguing in a way that other characters couldn't be. For me, what was really essential in turning any of these tropes inside out was recognizing that you could have a queer villain, but the villain was not a villain because they were queer. Mm-hmm. Queerness was a characteristic of theirs, but there were other things that very likely made them villainous. You know, in the case of some creatures, you know, they're born to be villains, you know, because we perceive their acts, which they consider to be either moral or necessary for their own survival, we perceive them to be threatening or frightening. Or you have creatures, and Nicholas, the monster in my book, has this particular aspect. You have creatures that things have happened to them, things have been done to them that that in particular awaken an aspect of villainy within them. And one of the things that is crucial in the book for a lot of the characters is loneliness. Mm-hmm. There is a tremendous feeling among many of the characters of isolation. Because of being queer, but also sometimes because of being in a queer community that is largely white, that is presented as largely male and largely cisgendered, particular, you know, age, particular, you know, sort of backgrounds and interests. And some people feel very alienated from that. And the creature himself, very lonely, perceives other people's loneliness as a vulnerability that he can exploit in order to catch them and consume them. And so that loneliness, that isolation, that vulnerability, which is something that I think all people are capable of feeling at different points in their lives, that loneliness becomes a real theme in the novel, because what are we looking for? We're looking for belonging. We're looking for community. We're looking for ways to connect with each other. And that's being denied from some of these people in the book. And that is what's leaving them open to attack. And that was very important for me to depict. And it was very important for me to get in touch within myself as well.
So, David, why don't we just pop into the questions for a moment?
Sure.
How did you decide on the supernatural elements of Red X?
Oh, that's an interesting question. So the last book, The Bone Mother, was centered around Eastern European fairy tale and folklore, and there were many, perhaps too many. There were many, many creatures, and I had made a decision early on when I was starting this book. There was going to be one. There was just going to be one. It was going to make my life a lot easier. I had a real interest in British. It's not really British. In English and Scottish, in that kind of folklore. I knew some stuff about it, but I didn't know a great deal. And I was really looking for something that would both embody human characteristics but also animalistic characteristics. And I didn't really want a werewolf. So, because I mean, I think werewolves are really interesting, but I think that they have a lot of sort of, cultural baggage attached to them. I wanted something that, of course, I was not aware that Barghists were a thing in the Harry Potter world, and of course they are. But for me, I thought here was a thing that I could have my own personal take on, and so that of course meant finding out more about them. So Barghists, also known as black shucks, and a variety of other things, are a traditional, either a spirit or a Fey adjacent kind of entity that, are howl in graveyards and are omens of death and things like that. And I thought there's probably a way to take this as a creature, as a force, and bring it from what I felt was a kind of the old world that we associate with Canada's ancestry at that time, and then move it into the new world, and isolating that creature and creating that feeling of loneliness that I was talking about earlier, and then I could explore, what that was like as a character and what that character's interactions were in that community, and that was really where of all the things that I looked at, that's where I saw the most potential. And I think it worked out. I think it worked out. Anything else?
Yeah, so we do. Yes, we have one more question.
Okay.
Could you talk about fear and horror and reality? I think reality or real emotions can sometimes be expressed through fantasy.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, when writing, I try to avoid a sort of a one-on-one kind of sort of either connection or comparison. I like things to have a bit more ambiguity and sort of a number of different possibilities presenting themselves. But I do like to see, first of all, for myself as a writer, I really need to feel the reality of what I'm writing. This is where there's a lot of sense memory that I employ in the work. I want to make sure that there are particular places, particular, feelings and textures and smells and sounds that ground me in whatever sort of world I'm creating, even if it's a world that does have a real life correlate. And then within that, I want to be able to build on that in unreal ways. I like to have most of I'm not somebody who can really write high fantasy. I don't really come up with whole worlds from scratch per se, or for that matter, certain aspects of science fiction lend themselves to that as well. What I really like to do is have that grounding of reality, build fantasy on top of it, and then explore how the fantasy can connect to that reality or reflect that reality in a number of different ways without necessarily nailing it down too firmly.
But I was wondering too, another one of the threads in the book, and we've touched on this a bit in our discussion, is grief. There's a huge thread of grief throughout the book, and there's the very sort of ordinary, I mean, grief is not ordinary, and I recognize that, but the grief of missing loved ones, right? So these men who disappear and the friends and the family who miss and love them, I mean, that's very much a grief in there. But there's also the grief of Nicholas, the villain, who, loses his lover in the book. It's such a huge genesis for him in very particular ways. But one of the other types of grief that really strikes me was the grief of characters like Elka and the mother of, and I'm forgetting, Lucille, the mother of Ryan, one of the characters in the book. And the grief that both of those women are dealing with is essentially the grief that you feel when a life that you assumed you were going to have is not the life that you are actually living. In the case of both of them, Lucille has a son, Elka has a husband, both of whom turn out to be men who are not who these women thought they were. And by extension, it means that their own lives, these women's lives, are quite different now as a result. And so there's a real grief around, grieving the life that they thought they were going to live, but are not. And I wondered if you could talk about that a little bit.
Sure. I think that, first of all, I think it is part of many people's experience that moment in their lives, particularly as, both of these women are older, you look back and you had an image of yourself, and your future when you were, say, in your 20s or 30s, that for whatever reason, for multiple reasons, has not actually played out the way that you expected. Also, you have an image of people in your life, and that image turns out not to be representative of reality. Someone has actually withheld their reality from you, and the tension around that has meant, in some ways, that you have lost this person. Either you've lost this person literally, they've ceased to be in your life, or they are lost in other ways. They may be present in your life, but you are simply shut out of aspects of their existence. First of all, that there's a lot of that between, me and my mother in the book as well, which was a very, which is a factual representation of how families that have, a queer husband, queer son, someone, that plays out very realistically for them as well. There are times where, you confront the fact that you are not fulfilling the wishes that your mother had for you or your father had for you. You are not going to play the family role that supposedly you were destined to play as the oldest son or whatever. Or if you do play that role, it's going to be completely inverted from what they imagined. And those losses, those disappointments, that grief is something that I think a lot of queer people either face within themselves or face within their families, and then the alienation that results from that is profound and is sharply traumatizing. And I wanted to depict that, but I also wanted to depict it in a way that these women weren't villains. Often when you read gay literature, particularly from the 80s, the 90s, where you have an unforgiving mother who is shut out the son and stuff they are almost they're almost Disney villains. They're almost two-dimensional villains, and you understand innately it's like, this is a terrible person because they don't accept their child. What kind of terrible person the thing is, this is an everyday occurrence. There are people who do not accept their children or do not accept, what's going on in their lives. This does not make them necessarily monsters. This means that they also are suffering from cultural issues that they have just taken on within themselves. And for me, it was really important to humanize them and to make their loss not generalized, not abstracted, not diminished, but real for them in a way that other mothers could read and go, and other wives could read and go, yes, I understand that. There's a woman who is South Asian, who actually comes to Canada searching for her husband who has disappeared. He had hidden from her, although not successfully from his other family members, that he was a gay man and that he was seeking out partners. And she, even though she's in the novel very briefly towards the end, it's clear she's there because of compassion. She's there because she loves him, and she's there because she wants to find him. And, it would be easy to not write that character, to leave that character out, or to have that character just be talked about by other people. But I felt it was really important to situate people in the book as part of a community that was experiencing community loss. They may, as individuals, not realize they're part of that community until very late in the story, but that community that they have amongst themselves is part of what allows them to overcome the monstrosity that's around them.
Yeah. that was one of my favorite parts of the book, that just the way that all those threads came together, and you have these people all together at the end, and they're kind of shell-shocked in a way, like they're just, you can see the grief kind of reverberating around them, and it felt so so powerful, and yet, as you say, so ordinary, like this, you know, these multiple kinds of grief. One of the things that I wondered about too, I guess on sort of on the subject of grief, you know, for myself as someone who's disabled and also bisexual, I deal with the fear and the worry around passing a lot, right? Where
Yes.
and you sort of touched on this as well with your disability, and feeling like, you know, am I crazy because sometimes I am disabled and sometimes I'm not, and how do you know, navigate those spaces? And I thought about this in the course of the novel too, because there is this thread of passing that also happens throughout the book, right? You've got sort of the wildly, because there are, you know, there's not just one villain, there are a couple of other villains in the book who make appearances, and you know that they are people who pass as normal people, whatever normal means, upstanding members of society, let's put it that way, and you know are shown to be not so much so. And I wonder sometimes about passing as a phenomenon, where you sort of, it's something that you do for survival. Certainly as a disabled person, you do it for survival because you don't want to be singled out. You don't want to be looked at or laughed at, or, you know, thought that you can't do X, Y, and Z because of your disability. But then that also contributes to the structures that sort of disenfranchise disabled people and queer people, you know, in the first place, right? By blending in to the background, you sort of, I worry that you make other people stand out sort of and take the heat. And I wondered if, you know, that was something that you thought about when you were writing the book, and something that you wrestle with, because you do talk about it in terms of the disability. And I just wondered how that worked for you.
Well, it's interesting because passing is not integration. Mm-hmm. Passing is, in fact, passing reinforces your isolation. It reinforces your alienation. It reinforces the feeling that you are excluded. And only by virtue of being able to simulate the sameness of other people, you're able to you know, invisibilize yourself to a certain extent. But that's not integration. That is not you being able to be fully yourself within a community. And it does, and as you've just basically said, it does more damage. It does more damage to the other people who aren't passing or who can't pass, and it does more damage to yourself. And there are aspects of that in you know, queer history and queer life. There are aspects of that in disability, absolutely. And it's very hard to come to your community, your family, your partner, your children as your whole self, and to continually be your whole self instead of striving to normalize, you know, suppress whatever it is that's individual and different about you, and normalize in order to accommodate other people. And the reality is that, I mean, for you to be recognized, for you to be integrated, for you to be part of the community as your whole self, accommodation works in multiple ways. We shouldn't be accommodating, you know, the dominant culture with our suppressing of ourselves. That, you know, as I'm saying it, that just sounds ridiculous. But so many people do it all the time. It's like, you know, I don't want to bother that person with whatever it is I'm going through right now. You know, sure, I may not be able to walk around the apartment, but I can still type. So I'm going to pretend that today is a good day, and I'm going to, you know, be a productive worker, whatever that is. And and you know, why are you thinking this way? What is this about? You know, and why is it on you? Why is it on you as the marginalized individual to, in some ways, support the perspectives that, you know, the erroneous perspectives that the dominant culture already has of you? Like, why are you conceding this way? And yet, concession for many people has been their entire lives.
Yeah.
It is easier, you know, not to tell people you're in a relationship. It is easier, why do my coworkers have to know that I'm in a relationship? You invisibilize your partner because it is easier for other people to deal with. We do this with family members. We do, if we go to a church, we do this with the fellow worshipers at a church. We do that, with, the workplace, all this. Why? Because, they can't handle it. Well, maybe they should handle it. What can we do together to overcome this attitude towards invisibilizing ourselves rather than being our entire selves?
That's so wonderful. Thank you. I noticed that there don't seem to be any other questions, so I do have one more question that I ask, but if anybody wants to pop in, please, now is your time. So my last question is really about horror sort of in general and the realm of speculative fiction. I feel like it's really having a moment. Like it's really kind of made the cross from, genre fiction into literary fiction, which, arguably the genre fiction tends to, have more of a reach anyway. So, but what do you think is behind that move? What is it about horror and fairy tales and these kinds of folk stories that people are clinging to in this given moment? Is it because the world around us is so weird these days that, we find solace in weird stories? Are we looking to escape from the strangeness of the world around us, or is it something else entirely?
Well, I think escape is interesting, because certainly a lot of what we would describe in genre, and it can be true of horror, is that feeling of escapism, that feeling that you're pouring your time and your attention into other people's problems that thankfully are not yours, and you think, well, it could be worse. I could be chased around by a guy with an axe. So but at the same time, genre in general, I mean fiction in general, arguably, but genre in general, there are ways for us to learn how to live our lives, but through a sharply different perspective, ideally. Ideally, you're not being chased around by an axe, you guy with an axe, in which case, if you are, you should put down the book. But what it says is, like, as we talk about all the time, horror has rules. One of the things that was great about Scream was that it, as a movie, was that it said horror has rules, and you actually had to stop and think for a moment about all the horror movies you've ever seen and whether or not they actually followed the rules. There is a certain comfort in knowing that there are rules. There aren't rules in life. Mm-hmm. There are rules in a story. And then you can see, okay, if I was in this situation, would these rules help me? We all have seen the story, where people, go, oh, let's split up and search for blah, blah, blah. And you scream, no, don't split up, stay together. But then, you can have a group of people who stay together, and then the floor gives way and one of them falls down 2 stories, and you have to go and find that person. Sometimes circumstances split you up. Sometimes circumstances break the rules for you. What do you do in those situations? And I mean, it's no secret right now at this particular time. I think we all feel a little traumatized. As Jamie Lee Curtis said, it's about trauma. And so now it's like, okay, what are the rules for trauma? Mm-hmm. How do we deal with trauma? Who do you turn to? How does it work? Can you deal with trauma by yourself? Can you deal with trauma with, your trusted friends? Do you deal with trauma with strangers? How do you make those determinations? Those, I think, are really important questions that a lot of people are bringing to everything they read right now. And I think horror is uniquely equipped to be able to help address those questions in a way that is safe. You can put the book down. You can turn off the TV. You can, if you feel that bad, you can walk out of the movie theater. You might want to do it in the first 20 minutes rather than, so you can at least get your money back. But you have an element of control as a result of it being a story that you don't necessarily have in your own life, and you can reflect on what you could do and would do if you were those characters, putting yourself within their minds, within their situation. And I think that is quite appealing for some people right now. I totally understand people who are like, no, I can't handle horror now. I want The Crown. You know, I'm all for that. But there are some people who are like, no, now's the time. If ever there was a time that I was going to, you know, get into horror, this would be the way. And then, you know, and in some cases they pick the most outlandish, ridiculous things possible that have no connection to life. And others are choosing things that are extremely intimate and specific and particular to the situation we're in now. And that's cool.
Yeah, absolutely. We do have a couple audience questions just before we go. Jen says, thank you for your book, David, and this discussion. I loved your book and I'm scared of horror. So we're done. And Steve says, will your next novel be another horror?
Yes, I can say that. I can say that. Absolutely. I have always wanted to write a haunted house novel. I think a haunted house novel is like an Alp that many horror writers feel they need to climb. And so I have a particular point of view on a haunted house novel. I have a particular point of view on the ghosts who would be inhabiting it. And I know that the central character is an older woman. She's probably about my age, which will make certain things easy as far as cultural references and stuff go, who is in fact returning to her childhood summer home that is obviously haunted. Her husband has committed suicide. Her teenage son is missing, and she believes the house has answers for her. And she's not wrong. So
are they answers that she wants, though? That's the
I'm gonna say no.
Oh, that's wonderful. Well, I believe we are at time, unfortunately, because this has been so wonderful. And just thank you so much, David, for bringing so much of yourself to these questions and for giving us such wonderful, meaty, wonderful answers to chew on and to think about. I mean, I'm not a horror reader either, and I absolutely loved your book, and it really has made me think anew about horror as a genre and the ways that it helps us as readers, and I'm so grateful for that. So I guess now I'll turn it over to Nancy and Erica to wrap things all up. But thank you all so much for joining us today, for being a part of this conversation. And yes, Red X, get it at your friendly neighborhood independent bookstore. It's a great novel. You will absolutely love it.
I also encourage you to get it at the library. Should you want to do so, the library is right there. And I would like to also thank you, Amanda, very much for your incredibly thoughtful questions, and thank you everyone else as well who asked anything or who enjoyed the chat. This has been really wonderful.
Yes, it absolutely has been a wonderful hour to spend with you, David and Amanda, and everyone who joined us today. And if you came in halfway, please do check on our YouTube page in about a week, and it will be posted there, and it will be archived there for the long term. So everyone have a wonderful night.
Thank you again.
Thank you.